think Daryl's taking it first, and then Tyler's taking it next.
All right. My first question, everyone, can you see the screen that I just shared?
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome, everyone. I know a bunch of you know me already, but it is pretty exciting to have Tyler here to talk about grizzly bears. And so our talk today is going to be something that you're not used to, because typically we talk about black bears. But today we're going to be talking about a tale of two species. We're going to be talking about both grizzly bears and American black bears. And before we dive in, I'm going to quiz you all. Does anyone know what kind of species of bear this is in this title slide? Because it can get tricky. Believe it or not, this is a black bear. A lot of people are confused. And
we got an answer in the comments. Brian Peterson said black.
Correct.
Yep.
Well, Brian's a
Is he a cheater?
well, he runs Bear Smart Durango, so you better know what.
Well, good job, Brian.
Yeah, he cheated. You should have put a really blonde, like cinnamon desert black bear in there.
I won't quiz people later, but I've got some examples that will blow your mind. So anyway, what we thought we'd do is we talk about these two species. These are the two species that can be encountered in the lower 48 states in specific areas, particularly in greater Yellowstone, Montana, Idaho. So we're going to talk about these two kinds of bears today. But before we get started, typically whenever I give these talks, I want people to understand who I am and the fact that you're getting some decent information. So I've got some title slides. For those that don't know me, I'm Daryl Ratajczak. Believe it or not, I used to be the manager of Appalachian Bear Rescue back then in the late 1990s. When I started there, it used to be called the Appalachian Bear Center. I did that for a number of years. Absolutely loved it. One of my favorite jobs. But then I moved over and started working for the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. And I worked my way up through that agency, and I became the TWRA's bear, deer, and elk coordinator for the state. And then did that for 7 or 8 years, and then I was promoted to be the chief of wildlife for the state of Tennessee. Did that for another 5, loved it, getting a little tired of some of the politics involved, so I decided to pursue my lifelong dream of living and working out west. So I jumped to the Rocky Mountains, and I worked for the U.S. Forest Service for about 5 years, and now I'm currently working for the Bureau of Land Management, still doing a ton of wildlife biology stuff, but large carnivores and especially bears are my passion. And with me on today's talk, we have Tyler Brasington, and I'll let Tyler introduce himself.
Thanks, Daryl. I'm Tyler Brasington. I'm currently based out of South Lake Tahoe, California, but for the better half of the last decade, I was a member of the bear management team in Grand Teton National Park. Also volunteered up in Yellowstone with their bear management program. Some of the other things I've done over the course of my career, I worked as a biological science technician for USGS doing wildlife disease research in Madison, Wisconsin, at the National Wildlife Health Center. And then I also served on a very short detail with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Grizzly Bear Recovery Program as part of an interagency team dealing with grizzly bear conflict in Jackson, Wyoming. And right now I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Nevada, Reno, and I'm going to be studying black bear health on the black bear population in the Lake Tahoe Basin.
Awesome. So what I figured we'd do today is I'm going to explain to you the two different species, the black bears and brown bears, and try to describe a lot of the physical differences between the two, which ultimately helps explain some of the behavioral differences. And then I'll talk to you for about maybe 15, 20 minutes, and then turn it over to Tyler, and he can talk more about grizzlies, because I imagine most of you folks would have more questions or interest in grizzlies since you all know everything there is about black bears. So, all right, real quick, you guys all know this. The black bear species found in North America, scientific name is Ursus americanus. And then this other bear species we find in North America, besides the polar bear, is what we call a brown bear. That bear, that species of bear, is called Ursus arctos. Now, well, what about grizzlies? I thought we were talking about grizzlies. Well, we kind of are. what you have to understand before we dive into this is what is the difference between a grizzly or a brown bear. And so this photo here shows what we typically call a grizzly. And again, that scientific name is Ursus arctos. This particular photo, many people would see this bear and call it a brown bear. Guess what? Its scientific name is also Ursus arctos. These are the exact same species of bears. Where there is a difference is the subspecies or variety of that animal. You all know, well, I don't want to use dogs because they're domesticated, but certain species of animals will look differently depending on their geographic region. So when you're dealing with grizzly bears, we're talking about bears that are found pretty much on the interior of North America in the Rocky Mountains. And then that other subspecies or variety, that Middendorfi, a lot of people call them Kodiak bears or coastal brown bears. And so again, they're different in look, mostly because of geographic differences, and that is the result of the food sources. So these brown bears that are feeding on primarily berries and other vegetation and occasionally some meat products, they grow to a certain size, and I'll talk about that later. That same species, when they're along the coast of Alaska or anywhere else where you see these huge salmon runs, they have a tremendous amount of protein coming into their diet, so they can grow huge. Again, it's the exact same species of bear, but they can look somewhat different based on their geographic region. So one thing to keep in mind, they're all brown bears. And there's a saying that every grizzly is a brown bear, but not every brown bear is a grizzly. So it just depends on where you find that brown bear, what nickname it gets. Now, if we're to look at bear ranges, we're going to talk a little bit about black bears. Now, if you look to see where black bears are found in North America, this is what you'd find if you came over on the boat with Christopher Columbus. But Eastern Europeans did really well at kind of pushing back bears. And so this map's not exact, but their range has been severely limited with the more people there are. They are found in most of the 50 states. There's, I forget the exact number, but it's like 42 states they're found in. But sometimes they're isolated small pockets. Now, if you look at the brown bear, this is what their range would look like, again, if you came over on the boat with Christopher Columbus. They were primarily a Western species. In fact, they were found all throughout the Great Plains when Lewis and Clark were beginning their expeditions. But again, these early Europeans loved shooting things they didn't really care for, and they really shrunk the brown bear range. And so this is primarily what it looks like nowadays. Now, you do see that little tip floating down in through Idaho, western Montana, and all the way into Wyoming. Those are the grizzlies that we typically talk about when we encounter a brown bear in the lower 48. Now, one thing I will tell you, their population, I forgot to mention the black bear population, but a brown bear population's only about 50 to 80,000 in North America. Now, when you look at the black bear population, much, much larger, anywhere from 500,000 to 800,000. It's really hard to know exact numbers. But one thing a lot of people wonder, like, which one of these bears may be more dangerous to encounter? Because people are admittedly afraid to run into a bear when they're on a hike. Now, if you look at statistics alone, it's pretty even when you're looking at attacks or even fatalities. You would think it would be weighted real heavily towards brown bears, but it's only about 60% brown bear and 40% black bear. But look at the difference in the population size. There's 10 times more black bears. And so, yes, the brown bear, the grizzly bear, checks the box as the animal you got to be really mindful of if you do encounter it when you're out on your hike. So what I want to do now is just explain some of the physical differences between black bears and brown bears.
Hey, Daryl, we got one quick question just popped up to clear up. Kirsten Vegas asked, what about polar bears? Are they a brown bear? If you want a quick touch on that. or I could, but you go
Yeah,
ahead.
go ahead, Greg.
Okay, so yeah, Kirsten, polar bears are their own species, Ursus maritimus, right?
Which is funny because it sounds like Ursus arctos is like, oh, Arctic.
Yeah, so maritimus, and the polar bear is more closely related to the brown bear, and they actually can hybridize. They're thought to have diverged much more recently than the black bear would have, and so polar bears can be considered an Arctic specialized brown bear over tens of thousands of years, and very adapted specifically to the Arctic. And that's why they're kind of special, because a polar bear really can't live anywhere else because it's so evolved for that very specific environment. But it is its own species, and they can breed with a brown bear, and it happens very rarely, but does happen in the wild. So we can get back to the brown bears.
Yes, thanks for that. A really good question, and appreciate the answer, Greg. So let's look now at the differences between black bears and brown bears from a physical standpoint. And so right off the bat, you think, well, there's got to be a size difference. And so here's a silhouette of the average adult human, male and female. Now, if you put the silhouette of a large black bear there, or average size black bear, it's about the same size as that man and woman. Now, there's going to be tremendous variation. But if you put a brown bear there, they can be much, much larger. Now, keep in mind, if you're trying to differentiate between a black bear and a brown bear, you could have a really, really big black bear and a somewhat smaller brown bear. So size alone will not dictate what type of bear it is. So right off the bat, some people might think, well, we're talking about black bears and brown bears. So color is going to be the differentiating characteristic. And unfortunately, or fortunately, this is so cool. This is what I love. Let's look at bears that could be black. The one on the left is a black bear. The one on the right is a brown bear, even though it's got a really blackish fur to it. Then you have some specimens that could be dark brown. Believe it or not, you can have a dark brown black bear, and most grizzlies tend to be towards that dark brown coloration. So black bear will always be on the left, brown bear will always be on the right. What about a light brown color? You don't have any light brown. Oh, well, you do have light brown colored black bears occasionally, and a lot of light colored brown bears as well. It even goes to blonde. Crazy enough, there are some black bears that can have blonde coloration. Now, keep in mind, most of these black bear color variants are found in the western states, not so much in the eastern states. In the eastern states, they're primarily black. But you also get blonde brown bears as well. And silverish, believe it or not, yeah, you could have some of these glacial bears. That the one on the left is a black bear, one on the right is a brown bear. And then last but not least, and I think these are the most beautiful bears. I've seen one of them down in New Mexico. It's kind of a mix. When I first saw a black bear with this coloration, I thought it was a German Shepherd coming through the woods. But you can have just crazy colorations. Okay. So size might not be the telltale characteristic, neither will color. So what do you have to look for? Well, if you look at any state wildlife agency, they always put out information on how to tell the difference between the two species. And there's 4 primary things to look for. First and foremost is claws. Then you can look for the hump. You could also look at the bear's ears and then its facial characteristics. So just remember the chef thing and you'd be all set. So what do you look for? Hopefully you can see my pointer on the screen. But the first one, claws. Black bears tend to have really short, very curved claws that are primarily used for climbing trees. This particular photo doesn't do it justice, but grizzlies or brown bears tend to have these long, much longer, like a couple inches long on their claws, tend to be much lighter. Oftentimes you'll see them almost white looking claws. The hump on a grizzly or brown bear is usually pretty distinct, and you don't really see a hump on a black bear, but you can't use that alone, because sometimes if a black bear is walking and it, depending if it steps in a depression or steps over something, it may appear to have a hump. So you have to use a whole combination of all of these characteristics. Oops, I didn't mean to go there yet. The ears. Black bears tend to have much larger ears in relationship to their head as compared to brown bear. Their ears will appear quite smaller because they have such massive heads. And then lastly, they often talk about the face, the straight profile versus a dished profile. And sometimes that's a little confusing for people to understand, so I included this slide. So if you're looking at the face on these two animals, this straight profile, when you look at the profile of the black bear from the tip of the nose all the way to the top of the forehead, it's relatively straight. There could be a little arc to it, but it's relatively straight, as opposed to these brown bears, which have a very pronounced eyebrow. And so you tend to have a dip in their face. It's concave, so to speak. And I guess you draw it like a dish like that, but that's what we're talking about when it has a dished profile. It has that pronounced brow ridge on its profile of its face. So with that, I'm almost done here. From the biology standpoint, physical characteristics. You have the black bear and the brown bear. Overall weight varies tremendously. Pretty much males are typically always bigger than females. So you could have black bears weighing anywhere from, adult black bears weighing anywhere from 150 pounds all the way up to 500. On average, a lot depends on where in the country you find them. In the Smokies, an adult male black bear will be in that 250, pushing 300 pounds. They can get much larger depending on the food source, but the females will only be 150 to 200 pounds. Brown bears, on the other hand, tend to be much larger. Now, this 1,000 pounds that you see there, that's when you're getting into the coastal bears that are eating a lot of the salmon. But the grizzlies that you'll find in Yellowstone will weigh anywhere from 300. Large ones will be upwards above 600 pounds. But they're much larger than black bears on average. Height-wise, when a black bear stands up, you're looking at anywhere from 5 to a really tall bear being 7 foot. Brown bears or grizzlies could be much taller. Diet is where they begin to get very similar in that they're both omnivores. They're opportunistic feeders. They will eat whatever they find. For the most part, plants run a whole lot slower than an elk calf, so it's much easier for them to feed on vegetation, but they will gorge themselves on any type of meat that they can get their hands on. And then last but not least is their temperament. Now, let me explain what I mean here. Black bears, most people know, are very docile, very wary. They're very skittish. You could scare them pretty easy. Now, when I say a brown bear or grizzly is aloof and standoffish, when I say aloof, I'm not talking just like kind of not very smart. I mean, like, he doesn't really care. They are wary of humans, but because they're much bigger, they're not as like intimidated by humans. And so they're more likely to hold their ground or stand their ground than a black bear. And a lot of this can be explained by just the simple physical characteristics. So behaviorally, they do a lot of the same things, but the breaking point of when they get scared, when they stand up, is typically because of their physical characteristics. Now, just to explain it a little more, again, both species, black bears and brown bears, are very wary of humans. If they can detect you coming, they usually hightail it out of there before you ever get a chance to see them. The thing is, with brown bears, you have to be very careful because say you were to surprise them or you encounter them with cubs or around a food source, they are much more likely to try to scare you off as opposed to you scaring them off. And so last but not least, both species of bears love their offspring. So whether or not it's a brown bear mother or a black bear mother, you don't want to mess with any female bears with their cubs. So just be super, super wary of both species of bears if you encounter them with cubs, because they're very, very protective of them. So with that, know your bears. The more you know, I teach this in all my classes. your knowledge often means their existence, but know your bears. The more you know about the species, what they do, their characteristics, the more comfortable you'll feel and the better you'll be able to react when you do have an encounter. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler to talk about some of his experiences with grizzlies and to potentially show you a few videos as well. So I'm going to stop sharing real quick. Any questions before Tyler jumps in?
I don't
All
see
right.
anything in the chat. I was going to say, Daryl, as you were mentioning, those were averages on size. I know everyone's got stories of monster bears,
Yep.
you know, from across the country that were well outside those sizes. We're all aware of the 900-pound black bear in North Carolina eating dead pigs and peanuts. So,
Yep.
yeah. But thanks for that representation. That was great.
No problem.
All right. Well, if there aren't any questions, I'll start off with see if I can share my screen. Here we go.
All right. It's up. We see it.
Cool. All right. And I will. Open this.
We're seeing it, just so you know, Tyler, we're seeing it in the percent. Oh, there you go.
There we go.
Yep.
Okay. So just for a little bit of context on what I'm going to be showing you first. So in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in particular, and throughout most of brown bears range globally, a lot of research and management trapping does take place. And that is that's solely responsible for what we know about bears right now. It's through a lot of the capture handling operations that do take place. And then that's also supplemented by some of the behavior that we're able to observe in bears. So this is a culvert trap. Basically, it's a giant culvert-like tube. It's kind of like the culvert that goes under the road with a guillotine-style door. And in the greater Yellowstone, these are baited with natural baits ranging from moose, deer, elk, you name it. It's a lot of roadkill. And so this is what we will trap grizzly bears and black bears with in the greater Yellowstone. On occasion, we've got some bears that exhibit a little bit more excitement when they're being released from the trap. And some of these videos that I'm going to show kind of articulate the excitement that you might see on very rare occasions from our grizzly bears being released.
I knew it.
Oh, did it freeze?
We
There it goes. It keeps going. Yeah. Yeah.
It looks
Tyler,
cool in slow
why don't
motion.
you stand on top of the trap and open the door?
Yeah, there are some photos. I don't know if I have any on hand right now, but there are photos from not too long ago of people standing on top of this type of trap and opening the door by hand. So, yeah, this is not the bear you would want to be releasing if you were on top of that trap.
How big is that bear, Tyler?
Oh gosh. This one, I don't remember what it weighed, but I'd like to say like 400, like between the 400 and 500 pound category. It was an adult male that was caught in that trap. And then let's see, I think the next one is a bear scratching on a tree. So play this. So a lot of people may have seen black bears, grizzly bears. You know, there's videos all over the internet of them scratching and rubbing on trees. So this is a way of chemical communication for bears, while also getting their, scratching their itch or itching their scratch. And uniquely in this video, what you'll see here is not only is this bear rubbing on the tree, but he's also urinating at the same time. So he's definitely marking this area. And this is a pretty, you can see just, all this claw marks on the tree, and definitely having fun with the tree there. But yeah, and uniquely with rub trees, bears, they have foot placement, so they will step in the exact same place, walking up to the tree on its approach. You'll have bears that will share and walk over top of the previous bear's, tracks, and there will be depressions from where they're basically walking, and they will rub their feet into the ground. So black bears and grizzly bears have scent glands in their feet. So when they do rub those into the ground, that's another way of them communicating to other bears in the area. And then I've got this. So this is a cool one. So we did a project in Grand Teton not too long ago, I want to say 2 years ago, where we were using LiDAR to actually map and create 3D models of bear dens. And so right now we're inside of a grizzly bear den. This is the den that I actually took Daryl. Daryl had a class that he brought out to Grand Teton, and we went out to this den site. So just kind of a unique thing. I'll play it one more time just so you can get an idea. So that back section, there's the entrance, it was dug at the base of a tree, and then there's kind of this tunnel, as we're entering the entrance here, there's the chamber, and there's not really a whole lot of bedding materials. So uniquely with grizzly bears, sometimes they'll bring in surrounding pine needles, they'll bring in pine boughs, branches, but on the occasion, sometimes they won't bring in anything at all, and sometimes it's a late denning experience, and they don't have time to necessarily make it a bear B&B, for lack of a better term, a natural bear B&B. So that's one of those dens. I'm going to try to play a video that
Tyler, how many do you think you could fit like 3 adult humans in that? Or like how big around do you think that would be?
Yeah, so the biggest den that I've ever been to, you could easily fit probably half a dozen people inside of it. 6 people, and that was a grizzly bear den. Even some of the black bear dens, it's really unique, natural den sites. It's a little bit of a struggle to get in, but once you get in, they open up a little bit. So it's very similar to wolves. I mean, wolves, it's quite a struggle to get into some of these tight spaces, but the chamber area is generally where they're going to be spending their most time, and that's where it's going to be the most luxurious and spacious in natural den construction, I'll say.
And keep in mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tyler, but grizzly cubs tend to stay with their mom 2 years before they part ways. So if you typically black bears tend to have a little bit more cubs than grizzlies. Grizzlies tend to have just the 1 or 2. We had the oddity with 399 a couple of years ago where she had 4. But can you imagine like these 2.5-year-old bears, grizzlies getting in the same den with the mom? It's got to be pretty spacious, some of these.
Yeah, it's like 1,000 pounds of bear in there. If you 400 pounders and a 400-pound female. Yeah. I was gonna say a lot of black bear dens I've been to, I could not get into. We would be lucky to be able to pull the bear's head out with the collar on it to get him off of there, and the chamber would be big, but the entrance would just be tiny. So that's typical with black bear females for us.
And it's advantageous. So grizzly bears and black bears, that smaller entrance, it's a protection device for other predators to come in and potentially snag cubs. So it is one of those things where it's advantageous to whatever bear species is using it. And I guess I'll also mention grizzly bears, most of the den construction that you see with them, it's going to be excavated. Very seldom do grizzly bears use natural cavities or any kind of rock dwellings in the GYE. It's mainly excavated at the base of a tree with a really robust root structure. Black bears are a little bit more opportunistic. I think black bears are more opportunistic in all aspects of their life. They just, they're going to exploit.
They're smarter. I think they're smarter. I think they think more. I think grizzly bears just like I'm strong. Let me use my strength. I played football with guys like that. It's like you're that big and strong. It's like, yeah, use your strength.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, those bears, they'll use everything from tree cavities to, I've even seen black bears where they they build nests. It almost looks like a robin's nest sitting on top of a marsh, and they just allow the snow to cover them up. And you would never know that there was a bear even denning there unless you basically used a thermal or infrared FLIR device to see the heat signature. But yeah, it's very unique. There's a lot more diversity in some of the denning habits for black bears as opposed to grizzlies. Although I will,
there's one question real quick. Jeanette Hill, she asked, black bears don't have collarbones and they can get into crazy small spaces. Is that the same with brown bears and grizzly bears? Yeah, I don't know for sure anatomy wise. I think a brown bear can probably fit into most holes that it can fit its head in. Is that true with Tyler? I know the hump might get in the way a little bit, right? But their heads are the dishness of its head. So, we like to say if they can get their head in there, they can get their body in there. Is that with grizzlies? You guys say that too? Yeah,
I think so. I mean, I've seen grizzly bears get into some really tight spaces. And that was kind of segue into a really unique situation with a beaver lodge. We've seen grizzly bears go into beaver lodges before and use those actually as refugia. So a place of taking shelter. So it's kind of wild. You think about beavers and a grizzly bear being able to get into one of their lodges. It's pretty unique. And then so going to the video now. So this is another release. This is a really angry bear. I'll say that. Older adult male, really scarred up. He chases the truck for probably, anywhere between 75 and 100 yards. So we've got different angles. Just given this bear's history in the past, we kind of anticipated that this was the response we were going to get from him. So without further ado, I will play this. And there might be, I don't know if the volume will come through, but just brace yourself in case there is.
In the south side of Chicago, better small town. And if you go down there, you better just beware of a man named Leroy Brown. Now Leroy, only trouble. He can stand about 6'4". All the downtown ladies call it 3 times. Bear, Leroy Brown. Better man in the whole downtown. Better than old King Kong. Either than the junkyard dog. And Leroy, he a gambler. And he like his fancy clothes. And he like to wear his diamond rings. And everybody's knows. He got a custom Continental. He got an Eldorado too. He got a 32 gun in his pocket for fun. He got a razor in his shoe. Bear and bear and he rolling around. Better man in the whole downtown. Better than old King Kong. Either than a
Man, Greg, can you imagine if your ABR releases were like that?
Yeah. I've never opened a trap from a truck before. Even when I did some grizzly bear stuff, we just stood really far away, and I'm like, man, I'm lucky we just stood really far away with a rope, and like probably should have had a truck some of those times, but yeah, we got lucky.
We'd have to up our insurance.
Yeah, we had one via canoe. I guess that was easy to get away from too. So yeah.
Yeah, I did have one release where, well, it wasn't a release. We were setting a trap and we had a family of bears come in on site. And unfortunately, I don't know people just don't think when you're in a stressful situation sometimes about what to do and how things should line up. And somehow I got left behind out of the truck when they started driving off. And so I was inside of the trap. And the two things that went into my mind were, do I trigger the trap and just lock myself inside of the trap? Or do I try to get out and, just get ready for whatever is going to come? And fortunately, the bears that came in on site, so food motivated, as are most bears. They were more focused and hyper fixated on the food source that was available to them than my presence, and I was able to quickly egress from the area and get into the truck that initially had driven off a little ways. So, but yeah, that's a little bit of an unnerving situation with that. We've had another one where we went to release a non-target capture, and then all of a sudden, we're getting out of the truck, walking up to the trap, and there's, multiple bears that are right there. And it's like, oh, got to change our game plan. And then you just sit in the truck and the bears are circling the truck for like, however long. I forget how long it was, probably like a half hour. It felt like eternity, but eventually we were able to get the non-target capture out of the trap and go about our day. But
yeah.
It's a lot of fun.
Can you talk about how you guys do a lot of pre-baiting with those research trap areas? Because a lot of folks, they're very familiar with a lot of conflict bear trapping that goes on here in the East, right, with black bears. And, conflict bear trapping is pretty similar across the country, but there's not a lot of heavy pre-baiting involved in that. And you guys have these sites that are heavily baited for weeks sometimes in advance, right? Can you tell people how that works and why it's really dangerous to walk into the trap site?
Yeah, absolutely. So with pre-baiting trap sites, so it's exactly that, what the term kind of conveys. We try to get a lot of smell. So we think about the sense of smell in bears. The statistic that's been thrown out is bears have a sense of smell 7 times greater than a bloodhound, 2,100 times that of a human. And that's all based on receptors, that they have in their olfaction that connect to their brain. So bears, really great sense of smell. They can smell for a long ways away, especially if the wind's blowing in the right direction. So that pre-bait time, those weeks leading up to actually rolling a trap in on a research site are really important, because we can put up a camera, we can, put bait on site, natural baits. So everything from, a full-size elk carcass to a moose to a bison, you name it. And we'll affix a camera there to see what kind of bear activity we're drawing into the site. And unfortunately, if it's, one of these situations where a bear's already been caught multiple times, we don't want to catch the same bear twice. Like, that's what we try to avoid. We're ideally trying to target bears that have never been caught before or that aren't currently monitored. So no radio collar, no ear tags or anything. And so that game camera will give us a really good idea who's coming in on site. But then once we get an idea of what bears are on site, we'll roll a trap in, we'll set the trap up. Most of the trap sites that we work in are non-accessible to the public. They're in backcountry settings. They're not close to trails or places where there's a lot of human activities or any kind of human networking with development or residential, anything like that, housing areas. We try to stay away from those unless it's a management situation. Research, we want bears in the wild, like completely backcountry. So some of the trap sites are only accessible via boat. Some of them are wheel-in. So you've actually got to get a team of people and you've got to wheel a trap in for any said number distance to set some of these traps. And the way that it works after the pre-bait, you roll the trap in, you set the trap. When you identify bears on site that are potentially target bears, which could be subadult males, it doesn't really matter. But ideally in the greater Yellowstone, the really important demographic group are adult females. And that's because they are the sole contributor to the population growth. We get information about how many litters they're having, reproductive life histories, average litter sizes, longevity. So that's all. You think about females and what they contribute to the population. They are the driving force. So ideally, we want to try to capture adult females and affix them with monitoring devices. And then during a capture, once they're in the can, as I would call it, we're gathering everything from blood to hair. We're getting tissue samples. So when you see bears with ear tags, we're actually using surgical scalpels. They're a circular scalpel that it's doing a biopsy punch. And that's what we're putting the ear tag through. That tissue sample is being preserved for DNA for further analysis. Hair, we can do everything from DNA to isotope analysis, looking at diets, stress levels. And then blood, it's kind of a gold mine for what you can answer with that sample. You can look at everything from the seroprevalence or the exposure to certain pathogens. You can just look at basic blood work, complete blood chemistry. with a differential, very similar to, for those of you that might have domestic animals at home, cats and dogs, you bring them to the vet, that blood is going to be kicking out what they call a CBC panel, which is similar to what your cats and dogs have in a veterinary setting. But yeah, trapping research is a lot different than management. Management, it's very fast paced. You don't have the time to be meticulous in your setup. And so you've got to be quick to, capture a bear that might be involved with human bear conflict, a bear that might be involved with human injury, or even sometimes a fatality.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I've got a question for Tyler.
Yeah.
And then we got a question in the chat that we should get to. But Tyler, this is going to be a tough question. I hate to put you on the spot, but you mentioned like the gold mine bears, like the adult females is what you're looking for because they're the main contributor to the population. And so many people are so very familiar with Bear 399, who most people, she was known as the Queen of the Tetons, and she was notorious for pumping out cubs. You know her life history and her lineage more than anyone I know. How many cubs did she have, and how many surviving cubs do you know of?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to pull up a graphic real quick because I've got it right here. So just to talk while I'm doing this. So Grizzly Bear 399, very just a notorious bear, very visible to the public and to the people that came to Grand Teton. And so she was an ambassador for grizzly bear conservation in a large sense, but that came like a double-edged sword because notoriety also can cause some unfortunate effects. And we can talk a little bit about that once I get this slide pulled up. Let's see if I can do this. Share. So with Grizzly 399, she lived, interestingly enough, she had, so let me get this all the way up. So at 27 years old, she became one of the oldest grizzly bears in the ecosystem to actually give birth to a cub and to have a cub of the year. And so this is her kind of her lineage life history right here. So she first had her very first litter was 2004. That cub died from natural causes. But then if you look at the rest of this, from 2006 on, how many natural deaths do we see here? There's only 2 in her entire lineage. So the moral of the story here is that bears and people don't mix. When we are sharing, bears are biologically programmed to be bears. They will do everything that they know how to do from evolutionary timelines and on. We are the sole reason for a lot of grizzly bear mortality. And so whether that's management removals because bears are getting into conflicts with people and they pose a threat to life and safety, or even vehicles that are striking bears. Unfortunately, 399 died from a vehicle strike. So, that is something to keep in mind as well. If you look at her lineage, most of these are management removals or vehicle strikes. And that is a cost of, living near and around the roadways. Now, the interesting thing about this graphic that it doesn't show is that most of the time 399 would successfully rear her cubs all the way to weaning. So, up to the point where she kicks them off and they're on their own. So a lot of this occurred in her absence when these bears were independent and on their own. Now that also is a very interesting thing when you really start to boil it down and look at it. That's also really interesting because bears are creatures of habit. And if we look at human bear conflict and even somewhere in the South Lake Tahoe area, there are the behavioral characteristics that are transmitted down from mother to offspring. And so, if you have bears that were brought up along the roadway, they are going to be a proponent of the environment to which they were raised. And so they will, navigate the roadways to the best of their ability. But to be honest, I haven't seen a bear navigate humans or the roadway like 399 did. It was pretty remarkable that she lived nearly 3 decades on in Grand Teton, and she never was struck by a car until 3 decades later. So, and it's part of that is because she was expanding her range and going well beyond where she was initially hanging out most of her adult life, which was in the confines of Grand Teton. She would go south of Jackson often, and that's where she met her untimely fate. She probably could have lived another couple years, to be honest, just given her health. I know some people were like, oh, she was thin, but, based on her dentition and just looking at, how she was navigating the landscape, I'm very convinced if she hadn't been struck by a vehicle, she probably could have made it another couple of years.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Daryl, you want to address some of the questions? And we got some. Some
I backed
earlier.
up. Yeah, I backed up a little bit. Brian Peterson, just so you know, I'm kind of nervous because besides Brian Peterson from Bear Smart Durango, Stephanie Payne, she coordinated wildlife human attack response trainings, and then my brother is on here, so I've really got to be on point. Anyway, Brian Peterson said, want to talk about how humans should respond to close bear encounters, and there's a setup based on the two different species. The one thing I want to say there is you cannot simplify how you are to react to a bear encounter. And what I mean by that is a lot of times state agencies or whoever try to come up with really simple messaging. And the one that I hear the most is, if it's black, fight back. If it's brown, lie down. That is very catchy, but it's not very good information because it's saying that your response should be based on the species of the bear. And that is not what you want to do. Your response to bear encounters needs to be based on the behavior of the bear, not the species of the bear. And I could share with you guys, well, I'll look for it, but depending on if the encounter, if it's a situation where a bear is acting defensive because you surprised it with cubs, or you surprised it at close range, it has cubs, you're by its food source. Whenever the bear is acting defensively, you want to just be really calm, back yourself out of that situation. The bear wants you to leave. Unfortunately, there's some instances where bears are acting more on the offensive, where they're trying to approach you to see if there's going to be some type of food reward. Most of the time it's because they've received a food reward in the past from either trash left behind or snacks out of someone's backpack or tent. In a very, 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 very rare instance where it's predatory, the food reward is the person itself. But in any type of offensive situation where a bear is trying to approach you, that is where you got to try to stand your ground and back that bear up. Let him know that you're not anything to mess with. So behaviorally, your response should always be based on the bear's behavior at the time. So if anyone wants to take any of the other questions, Tyler, why don't you answer? Are brown bear populations increasing, decreasing, or generally remaining steady?
Yeah, so the one thing, I'm just going to pull up another slide real quick. So this is kind of an important one. So if we're looking at all 8 bear species globally, the 3 that we have here in North America, we've got the brown bear, American black bear, and the polar bear. And if we're looking at, in terms of if the populations are stable, honestly, brown bears and American black bears are of least concern. Polar bears are the bear species in North America that is of most concern of the 3 that we have here. But on a global scale, most bear species are listed as vulnerable, and this is based on the IUCN categorization. The only bear species globally that's actually endangered right now are the giant panda. And if you think about why that might be, it's a sole proportion. It's based on their diet. Their diet and the fact that they are genetically isolated to several populations throughout China. I think there's half a dozen different populations in certain areas. But really, the panda is the bear species we need to be most worried about. Brown bears, they have one of the largest distributions of all bear species. And part of that is because of just how adaptable they are in their food sources. So they have a lot of what we call dietary plasticity, meaning if one food source disappears, they can easily shift to another. And if you think about American black bears, that's also why they are so widespread across North America as well, is because they exhibit some of the I would say that they're a great example of behavioral plasticity too. They're complete opportunists, probably the most opportunistic. And as Greg said, I think black bears are probably one of the more intelligent of the 3 species we have in North America. But yeah, I think brown bears, they are, they're doing good on a global scale. Now, if we're talking about North America, obviously it's a little bit different. We have different population segments. The GYE, there's a big push for delisting in the tri-state area of Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. And I'll hit this, as simplified as I possibly can. Bears are biologically recovered in those areas by the criteria that were established by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I think the bigger question that we need to ask ourselves is about social tolerance for these bear species. And we've got to be looking at that as well. I think social tolerance is a huge thing for bear species moving in the areas that they haven't been in nearly a century, and sharing the landscape with people. So I think there's a lot of coexistence practices and strategies that we can push out to people. But yeah, that's my abbreviated answer. I think.
Tyler, do you want to get into what Denny asked there with the grizzly management being turned over to the states and the, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho? Obviously, they're looking at state management, and I have a lot of friends in Montana that say it gets very political. So let's try and keep it as least political as possible. What do you expect to see as a result of that outside of those recovery areas?
Yeah, I think all politics aside, I think it's great to see that the states have the ability to manage the bear populations. And the reason that I think it's great is because this is what the Endangered Species Act is all about. It's about recovering species biologically and returning the management back over to the states. If for whatever reason the states exhibit an inability to manage the population, well, they can go right back on federal protections. I think that's the matter of fact. Daryl, do you have anything to add regarding?
Yeah, I agree with you, Tyler, there. I just want to let you know, I do a podcast, myself and Stephanie Payne, we do a podcast. And just last week, we did a podcast on that exact issue of what's going on with grizzly bears. And we try to present both sides of the story, where it is definitely a good sign when things come off the list. That means they're near in recovery. But trying to explain what actually took place, they're not proposing to take grizzlies off the endangered species list. What they're doing is just they still remain on the list, but to give the state more management control of dealing with conflict issues. Because right now, if anything happens with any grizzly that's in a conflict issue, the state has to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has the ultimate call. Now, these bears are expanding all over the place, so it's very difficult to be in every place at all the time. So giving the states more control to make some of those management decisions, that's pretty much the step that they're moving towards. They're not proposing hunting seasons. They're not doing anything like that. It's more or less just allowing the states to have a little bit more ability to make some of those harder decisions.
And Stephanie has her hand raised. If she wants to chime in, Stephanie, go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to speak up.
Sure. Well, it's actually a question for Tyler and actually for all of y'all. So the social acceptance, and hopefully I'm not echoing terribly bad, but do you see a difference in the persons that live in bear country and their social acceptance as opposed to those who only either get internet feed or just recreate occasionally? Because a lot of times the things I've seen is the people who don't really live in that world are the ones who like to talk the loudest.
Yeah, and I do think that is something that's to be considered. I do see that. It's a great example is South Lake Tahoe. People like to kind of shoot from the hip from 1,000 miles away, but they haven't actually been here and experienced the situations that are ongoing in this ecosystem. And so it's hard, it's hard until somebody puts eyes on the situation or you're actually immersed in it, to really be empathetic and understand where the other side might be coming from. And I think with conflict management in particular, I think the biggest thing is that there seems to always be this focus on the the sole objectives or the things that drive people apart, as opposed to what is the commonality and what brings people together. And I think the bottom line is anybody that works with bears, I mean, Greg included, everybody, like, I can easily say that we didn't get into this, line of work because we want bears to, have ill will. We don't want bears to die. We are fully invested in the conservation of these species. And so, when when you hear about people that are intentionally attacking certain, states, or, there's always going to be room for improvement. We all know that. But, a lot of the people that have been in roles like myself, where you're the biologist on the ground, we want nothing best. We want all the best for both bears and people. And that's a difficult challenge. I mean, it is difficult. It's not easy. So I think that'll mainly be my answer. But yeah, until people actually are in, up to their ears in some of the conflict stuff and living with bears, it's hard for people to grasp some of the realities of sharing a landscape with them.
Yeah, I agree with that, Tyler. I get a lot of phone calls from different people. They call us for all kinds of reasons here in East Tennessee. And, Tyler, I don't know if you've been to East Tennessee. We're running out of room for bears. We're running out of habitat. I did 4 interviews today, and I made sure every reporter knew that our bears are really running out of space. And that's where a lot of this comes from. And, the orphan cubs that we get oftentimes have some conflict tied to them, really. And, when we talk about the social tolerance and the conflicts some people are facing, you got to see some of these conflicts in person to understand the nuances involved in it and some of the hardships that people have generated by, the tourism, and then also, the tolerance of bears and just their landscape and their bear populations. And there's so much detail there. And I think people on both sides, the wildlife agencies, the state governments, and then the public, want to implement really simple solutions. Some wildlife biologists have one tool in their toolbox and they use it over and over again, and it's a Band-Aid, not a solution, right? And some public want to save everything and help everything, and it's not the solution either. We got to work together, and we got to have conversations. And it's like politics in everything right now. We really need people talking to each other from across the room and understanding where people come from and putting aside their egos. And that's super hard for wildlife biologists. If you guys ever worked with any of them, it's a heavy ego-driven field. You can go to a workshop or a conference and you can listen to everyone knows everything about the animal that they work with. And if anybody disagrees with them, they're just stupid. And it's a problem in the wildlife world, in the bear world. And, they're laughing because they've seen it. And we've been to similar workshops and conferences. And I think we're working towards solutions. The Human Bear Conflict Workshop, which we are a part of the organizing committee for, the next one will be in Winnipeg in 2028. The Human Bear Conflict Workshop really has a lot of hope in it. And there's a lot of biologists and a lot of nonprofits and government organizations from way different branches than just wildlife management who are getting involved and finding solutions to problems across the world. And when you start hearing about the problems in Japan and India and comparing them to what's going on in America, you're like, man, we're actually doing a pretty good job. So it helps you with perspective. And I think people need to hear that more. And we need to have more empathy for each other. So I'll stop talking so much so Daryl can get to these other questions. We got some good ones in the chat.
I'll just ask them to Tyler. So another question from the chat, Tyler. For research, if you're trapping females, are results representative of the area bear population as a whole, or could male behavior, etc., be entirely different?
Yeah, so I guess biologically, so adult males have some of the largest home ranges, but then you've got subadult males that even top that. So subadult males are a demographic in the population where they move around the most. And part of that is just trying to find their space on the landscape while also trying to find breeding opportunities. Females generally in the GYE, they've got a pretty, I don't know how to calculate this because it's in kilometers, but generally females, they've got pretty small home ranges in Yellowstone and in the GYE. And part of that is because, if they have cubs, it's a security feature of being able to stay in a closer, tight-knit area. So to your question, if you're trapping one particular area, you're likely to only have, a handful of females that overlap in that area. And I guess that's another important thing that I will hit on, is that bears are not territorial. So there is a lot of spatial overlap in their territories or home ranges. And so while they may not be in the same place at the same time, they do use the same habitat types. So it's not like, if you think about wolves, there aren't necessarily territories where they're going to fight over a particular area. Bears are very tolerant. And particularly even, in high densities, you might start to see if there's an abundance of food and they're not nutritionally stressed, you'll start to see tolerance a lot more than you will of like exclusion, where they're going to be fighting each other or contesting one another. But yeah, hopefully.
And Tyler, that male overlap is a big problem with your research trapping, where you guys are trying to get the females and the males just keep hitting those bait sites, and you get the trap happy males that hit them over and over again. Right.
Yeah. And
That's,
you might have the same bear at like 4 or 5 different sites, all in Yellowstone, and it's the same male. And that really just articulates how well they get around. What takes us, days to travel, it's, 24 hours for them. They're very good at navigating the landscape.
Next question. You kind of touched on the urbanized South Lake Tahoe bears, right? The poster child for conflict, and it's similar here. Let's answer Mary's question. She wants to know about differences between North American and European brown bears. Mary, I'll answer that. I went looking for the Italian brown bear on my honeymoon with Katrina recently. We did not find the elusive Marsican brown bear in the Apennines because there are very few of them. So those brown bears, like Tyler said, they're the most widely distributed species of bear, but there are a lot of pocket populations across Europe and East Europe and into Asia of these brown bears that have been very isolated. Spain and France have very isolated pockets of bears, just like Italy. And you do see ecotypes across those brown bears and subspecies. The Marsican brown bear, my favorite species, is critically endangered in central Italy and has been isolated for a very long time from other European brown bears. And they're pretty unique, but they are all, at the end of the day, brown bears all across the world. What's the next one? GYE. Tyler, can you talk? I knew someone was going to. Greater Yellowstone, Brian answered it. Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Tyler, can you talk about the bounds of the GYE and the North, the Continental Divide, just so people know that those two ecosystems with the grizzlies?
Yeah, let me see if I can. I don't know if I have a map.
A picture would be good. These two populations, guys, just so you know, it's the grizzly in the interior of the U.S. You've got the Continental Divide and the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and they're trying really hard to connect those two together. I have a friend who works in Montana trying to look at genetics and actually moving bears around to make them connect. And it's just divided by a little bit of land that it's hard for bears to pass through to go back and forth. But the hope is bears from the GYE, Greater Yellowstone, and bears from the Continental Divide population, being glacier in that area, would connect eventually. But even in Montana, there's still enough people to get in the way.
Yep. I'm trying to pull up a map real quick, so I'll share this. Okay, so you've got, this is the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem where I've got my cursor over top. And then if we were going to look at the GYE or the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it's this one. And then trying to find in between, the easiest way to look at this is probably through this map right here. So if we're looking at, this is the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem down here. And then you've got the Northern Continental Divide, and that includes Glacier National Park up there. So the biggest thing that lies in between both of these ecosystems is I-90, which is a giant interstate, major interstate highway. And unfortunately, that causes habitat fragmentation. It causes the inability of bears to actually be able to navigate across. I don't know if I have it readily accessible, but I used to have a slide from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks that showed, nearly 36 times a grizzly bear tried to cross I-90. and it was turned away. And part of that is just because of how busy that highway is, and bears don't want to risk. It's all about risk and, essentially gauging whether or not they're going to be able to get across the highway safely or not. And a lot of times those bears are just turned away. And so that does inhibit the genetic information from these populations to intermingle. And so you may have heard, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, but that's this map right here. This is not a very great map, but they had 2 grizzly bears that they dropped from the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem into the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem as part of a genetic augmentation project. And part of that was to exchange that genetic information to put it into the population. The true success of this is not going to be measured for multiple years. So essentially what needs to happen is this male needs to breed with a female in the GYE, and the female would need to breed with a male in the GYE, and then they would actually need to complete a reproductive cycle and have those cubs go on to breed, and then that genetic information would continue further on. So it's not, a lot of people, challenge the decision to genetically augment the population in Yellowstone, but I think it's a good step in the right direction, because we're not going to get a bunch of wildlife crossings in I-90 anytime soon. So it's, a really easy, quick way to get that genetic information into these populations and ensure that they're genetically stable for the long term. There's no risk right now, but it's better to be proactive in these situations than being reactive and waiting until it's too late.
Yeah, a good point there, Tyler. Grizzly bears have a pretty slow reproduction window compared to black bears, and you can definitely see that with their populations as they get into more stressed habitats, especially. So, grizzly bears don't have cubs as often as black bears, and they don't have as many. So they're more prone to inbreeding concerns, especially if they're not as widely distributed. And that was part of the Cabinet Yak and Selkirk project, right? Was trying to prevent some of that real bottleneck gene pool. And we see that with other animals. Daryl talked about that with the Florida panthers. That becomes an issue with these carnivores. They can't travel. Denny asked about investments in wildlife bridges. They work where they work when a lot of people put a lot of money and work into it. The bottom line is they didn't evolve. These animals didn't evolve with these big highways, and we didn't really consider their travel corridors when we built them. It was built for military to move stuff across the country quickly and effectively. And I guess during World War II or post World War II, we just didn't really consider wildlife at the time. So
just so you know,
by us, yeah.
Just so you know, that's a huge part of my job now. I do a lot of wildlife migration for some of these larger mammals in the West. And so we're finding out more and more that these animals have huge migration routes. You don't get it as much in the eastern states, but in the West, with these mountainous regions, you're having animals, especially the ungulates. What I mean by that is the deer, the elk, the pronghorn, any hooved animals. They will have their summer range where they're feeding on the highly nutritious new growth will be high up in the mountains, and then in the winter range, when all the snow comes from the mountains, these animals go down to the winter range, which are down in the valleys. And the difference between the summer range and the winter range is sometimes 80 to 100 miles. Crazy in Wyoming, some of the migrations that the pronghorn make. But those overpasses, we're working more and more on those things, but they're hugely expensive. I think the one in California that they just put in for the mountain lions were tens and tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah. So it all goes back to what are these animals worth, right? And, I think that we're learning more and more that it's not just about meeting some number that was arbitrarily drawn or lines on a map, right? There's a whole social value to wildlife. And just because a population is healthy or stable doesn't really tell the whole story. Tyler's going to learn more about that in Tahoe and hopefully share us some of his PhD info about those Tahoe bears. And we keep on doing as much research as we can here in East Tennessee and the Appalachians. You'd think that it's all been done, but there's always more to learn. We learn more about our bears and the struggles that they face every day. And the most impressive takeaway, I think, is how resilient these animals are, because man, we just make life hard for them. Even without knowing it, we make life hard for bears and every large carnivore, and they persist despite our ignorance and our folly.
Craig likes to say that he thinks that they have a bear-human conflict meeting.
Yeah, I like to think
annually.
about when the bears meet up and talk about us. What do they say? But Daryl talked about it with the panthers and the cougars, and we've talked about other species and stuff. Man, some of these animals, when Europeans came here, they did a really good job of messing things up really quick. Interfering with thousands of years, tens of thousands of years of evolution in a blink of an eye in a timeline.
Yep.
So we're good.
All right. If I could do a shameless plug real quick.
Yeah, please, Daryl.
Go ahead.
I'm going to go back to my slides. Hopefully you can see it. So anyway, for those that don't know, I did write a book about some of my time at the Bear Center. So if you're interested in reading my book, you can find it on Amazon. But the main thing I wanted to plug, I've mentioned it briefly. I do a podcast with Stephanie Payne, who was on she's still on the call. We do one every couple of weeks. It talks about all sorts of wildlife issues, but we try to present both sides of the story. Nowadays, if you listen to podcasts, you definitely get the opinion of one side of the story. We try to present both sides. So she does an excellent job at we talk going point and counterpoint. Last week, we did talk about the Grizzly regulations changing. The next podcast we're thinking of doing, I'm sure many of you have seen a video recently of a bear encounter in Banff National Park where a couple had their little dog off leash and they were backing up down the trail because they encountered a grizzly, and they recorded the encounter, and the dog was still running around. The bear didn't go after the dog, but they posted it because it was a very intense encounter with this grizzly and the couple with the dog off leash. And now I just learned today that they are the provincial government there is slapping a $25,000 fine on that couple for having that dog off leash. They're very, very strict in Canada, especially around their provincial parks. So anyway, we're going to talk about that on an upcoming podcast, but just look up Wildlife for You either on Spotify or Apple Podcasts.
And we do sell Daryl's book in our store too, guys.
Signed
we have signed copies in our store. So if you're in Townsend, you can buy Daryl's book where Daryl got his start, and it's signed by him, and it only costs, I think, a little bit more.
I
Not
had to ship them out to you guys. All right. I think I'm done here, Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler. Thank you, Daryl, for your time. We really appreciate you giving us insights on the other side of the bear world, both geographically and species-wise.
And Jamie's going to take over running these and scheduling guests, so we'll make sure she gets